Do you think these people care about us peacefully expressing our opinions? If they cared about that, this wouldn't be a problem now. If they cared about that, George Floyd would be alive right now. So with Mike Brown, don't be an outsider.
Los pacos son bastardos. Son asesinos a sueldo. Son violadores a sueldo. 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 Los pacos son bastardos.
Peaceful marches where tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people march through town on a pre-approved route with cops standing on the sidelines recording everybody's faces and counting the overtime. Then people sat and listened to speeches from the same old bureaucrats who always speak at these things. Speeches everyone in the audience could have given because they're the same every time. And then everybody fucks off down the pub. Like clockwork, within 24 hours, somebody will get shocked, outraged even, that the news didn't cover the march. Yeah. One thing. Just one thing. Why the fuck would they cover it? Why the fuck would they cover it? It was a non-event. Nothing happened. A bunch of people went on a walk, and then they went for drinks afterwards. If the news covered that every time it happened, it would be all they ever talked about. These marches all sort of run together in my mind. Really, not one of them was anything even closely resembling some kind of turning point in whatever the struggle was. Nobody in power even acknowledged them. They were non-events. They did nothing more to prove that 100,000 people can get together in a strategic part of town and have so little imagination that when they leave, there's nothing to let anyone know that they were even there in the first place. Some people who are watching this might not be old enough to remember, others probably are, the day when millions marched in Stop the War protests against the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq back in 2002, 2003. Millions. It was probably the biggest protest ever to take place against a war that hadn't even started yet. It was called Stop the War, and you hear people still, in Britain in particular, you hear people who are involved in the organization of the thing still saying that it was a success, because lots of people came. And they all filed through central Westminster, and then they fucked off home. Meanwhile, the war that it was supposed to stop, yeah, that shit hasn't stopped yet. That's still going on. The war that the Stop the War protests, the supposedly successful, peaceful Stop the War protests, was supposed to stop? Yeah, that thing's still going on. 17 years now. 17 fucking years. Do you think Iraq and Afghanistan are such reliable sources of refugees because they're so peaceful? The Stop the War protests did not stop the war. By any rational measure of success, they were a failure. They were all of our failure that who were around there didn't do anything other than just kind of walk and register our objections. They were a failure because they relied on the democratic instincts of institutions that simply don't have any democratic instincts. It only matters if you register your objection to whatever's going on if the people in charge of what's going on actually give a shit what you think about it. They didn't give a fuck what they think about it. The ruling class doesn't give a shit about what we think. It's what we do that matters. Polls have consistently shown that between 60 and 80%, huge percentages, significant majorities, more people at least twice as many as have voted for any president who actually won an election in my lifetime. Vast majorities of the population hate the health insurance industry in the U.S. and want a single-payer system. Depending on how you ask, it's more, it's less sometimes. Nearly always a majority. And then it's not a majority, it's damn close. It's a plurality, even. Back in the early 90s, Hillary Clinton's first big thing on the public stage was she was put in charge of the Clinton administration's healthcare reform. And one of the anecdotes that's come out since then was one of her aides came up to her when she was still brainstorming ideas and whatever the hell, said, you know, the majority of the population supports a single-payer system like they got up in Canada. You know what Hillary Clinton said? Tell me something interesting. If these are democratic institutions that have some kind of fundamental democratic instinct, that would be a very interesting fact. The majority of the population hates the way healthcare is done in the U.S. It has a very specific thing that they'd really like to have. A thing that no one in the media told them was a good idea. In fact, the media universally say it was a shitty idea. Threaten people that it would be, it would be downright communism. Pity that that is the case. The entire political class basically always says it's a bad idea. People are constantly being told it's a horrible idea, and yet still the majority says, when they're asked, that they think that they would like single payer rather than this fucking shit show of a non-healthcare system that kills 70,000 people on average every year and makes billions and billions and billions of fucking dollars. If there were democratic instincts in these institutions, the fact that there was majority support would be basically all that mattered. The rest of it would be a question of how to get it done. There are no democratic instincts in these institutions. They exist to represent the ruling class and to keep the rest of us in check. And as long as we're quiet, as long as we don't do anything that disrupts their way of doing things, their profit system, well, then there's really no reason to give a fuck about us, is there? That's the lens to think about all this talk about peaceful protest. I mean, it's interesting because you get people saying that the peaceful protest is really what's going to force the ruling class's hand. That's the really effective thing. Extinction Rebellion relies on a Pentagon-funded study, used really super fucking dodgy definitions in order to say that peaceful protest, non-violent protest is the most effective thing. Couple of things. One, that study's bullshit. Andrew Flood did a great video, I'm going to link to it in the comments, about why it's bullshit. But the short thing is it's bullshit and it's Pentagon-funded bullshit, so that's like the special kind of bullshit that you should really take with an extra big grain of salt, I think. But you still hear people saying it. In fact, just about every movement that has been successful in forcing at least part of its demands to be accepted by the ruling class, the civil rights movement, trade unions, the rest of it, it all gets presented as passive resistance, as non-violent. Either that's not the whole story, or it is just downright false. Right now, with this rebellion that's going on in so many parts of the U.S., after yet another fucking cop killed yet another defenseless black person, murdered him in front of a camera, on film, the whole thing. There is no dispute about whether this guy did it and what he was doing. And the prosecution, what did they say? Well, before things kicked off, what they said was, yeah, we're not really sure. Give us a couple of months. We'll work it out. This is a complicated situation. As a lot of people have pointed out, reverse that shit and tell me how complicated it would be for a prosecutor to immediately demand the death penalty. That shit would not be complicated if it were the other way around. But suddenly, it becomes much less complicated when you've got whole sections of the city in frank revolt, fucking police stations being surrounded, chain stores getting looted, suddenly that becomes a lot less complicated. And suddenly, you start hearing about the fear of outside agitators. It's not always, they don't always use those words because, I mean, you use those words, you're just openly quoting white supremacism. You're just openly quoting one of the most famous white supremacist phrases ever, because if you remember, the civil rights movement was supposedly all outside agitators. Outside agitators for communism that are just stirring up our people here. Every fucking Southern governor in the 1960s said some version of that shit in order to avoid acknowledging the fact that people had had enough. That black people in particular had enough. The idea, let's talk about what an outside agitator is, because you hear versions of this, where it's this idea that, for example, anytime somebody does anything the slightest bit confrontational, direct action-y, that deviates slightly from the idea of just going on a walk and then fucking off home. You hear that some people, liberals, will tell you, oh, that means they're a cop. You gotta stop that shit. I'm serious. There's no excuse for that. That gets people fucking killed. COINTELPRO, the FBI's program to get rid of the political opposition in the U.S., was based heavily on just throwing about completely baseless accusations that somebody was an infiltrator. The people making the accusations were in fact working for the FBI. It was a way of protecting their own cover and dismantling the organizational culture and turning people against each other. If you haven't got something much better than, threw a rock at the cops when they were starting to fire gas grenades at the protesters, if that's all you've got, shut the fuck up. That's not proof that somebody's an outside agitator. That's proof that somebody was engaging in self-defense. Yeah, that's right. Self-defense. That's a thing. I mean, there's this idea you sometimes hear, especially amongst liberals, that you'd think that protests were something completely outside of the normal way of doing things, where somehow the idea that you have to be peaceful means that even when you're getting fucking shot at, you're not allowed to do the slightest thing to fight back. And if you do, it's somehow suspect. It's bullshit. The outside agitators aren't the problem. The Russians, who I've actually already heard white liberals saying are behind all this rebellion, are not the problem. And when you say that one white guy supposedly managed to set off this entire rebellion in Minneapolis and the rest of the country by smashing a couple of windows and then just coolly walking away, think about what you're saying about the people doing the rebelling. You're basically saying that they're a bunch of empty vessels, that all they needed to see was one white guy break a couple of fucking windows, and they'll totally kick off. Newsflash, motherfucker. People don't kick off when they didn't have that already in their mind. People don't just riot out of nowhere. People don't just go one moment from, we're going to just have a nice little march and register our objections and then go home. And with no thought at all that maybe this would be that maybe things should be broken, to full-on rebellion just because one person breaks a couple of fucking windows. Get that out of your head. You're basically saying that especially the black community, who are at the core of this rebellion, are a bunch of empty vessels, just a bunch of mindless automatons looking to see what some random white guy nobody's heard of did. That is bullshit. It's also fucking racist. And it puts you in a long line of horrible people. Because that's the line that they took against the civil rights movement. It was just communist agitators. They were blaming the Russians then, too. That's a long tradition in this country. That it was... Now, that's not to say that communists weren't heavily involved in the civil rights movement. Of course, all kinds of communists were involved in the fucking civil rights movement. And every single major movement towards social progress in this country, and pretty much anywhere else, you always find revolutionaries in there. That's not some unseemly thing. That's what revolutionaries are trying to do. is actually make things better and move things in a just direction. That's kind of the point of being one. I'm not worried about outside agitators, and nobody should be worried about fucking outside agitators. What we need to worry about, what really will kill a movement, is outside fucking tranquilizers. Outside tranquilizers. These people who have absolutely no connection to a community. These people who often do have connections to, like, liberal NGOs and the Democratic Party and all the rest of that. And they think, and they have this idea that it should all just be a nice little walk in the park and register our objection and be generally uneventful and just bottle up all that fucking rage that people justly feel when fucking state terror is your everyday life. Rage is a fucking natural thing. But these liberal NGO types who want everything to be peaceful, these outside tranquilizers, will act as if that's somehow a bad thing. Now, why exactly is peacefulness a term that requires more inverted commas than the universe has? Why is that supposedly such a good thing? Surely the question isn't whether it was peaceful, but whether it was effective. You go out in the streets for a purpose. You have something you want to happen, whether it's you want to kill a cop to actually get charged and arrested, or you want to stop a fucking war, or you're trying to get paid a living wage, or you don't want a fucking oil company to build a pipeline over your sovereign native land and ruin the water supply. There's a purpose in it. And the way you have to judge these things is whether they contributed to that purpose. If it's peaceful and somehow the purpose is achieved, good, fine. Probably the safest route to go. But the thing is, that doesn't really happen all that often. We're talking here about an urgent objective. According to the Malcolm X grassroots movement, something like once every 28 hours on average, cops or some kind of racist vigilante asshole go off and murder one more black person. That's almost once a day. And those figures are from a couple of years ago. It's probably more now. People thought that getting it on film might actually put a stop to it. You know, if the evidence was there, the prosecutors couldn't deny it, right? Well, it turns out now, you get it on film, the whole world fucking sees it, and the whole question is, will they get charged? That is proof. That is proof beyond any kind of doubt that the fucking regime does not give a shit what people think, doesn't give a shit what people know, doesn't give a shit that people actually saw this murder, saw every single bit of it, know what happened, but it's still a question. It still requires a goddamn rebellion. Back in 1968, Congress was sitting on a piece of legislation, a fairly important piece of legislation that has been the target of right-wing attacks ever since then. It was the 1968 Civil Rights Act. When Martin Luther King Jr. got assassinated, they'd been sitting on it for about a year. Then the riots came. There were riots all over the country over the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and they passed that thing in a real fucking hurry. Don't be an outside tranquilizer. Disruption is what gets the goods. Scaring the ruling class is what gets the goods. Showing that you have the power, your community, your class, your people have the power to fuck their shit up. That is what makes them sit up and take notice and start to think about making concessions. Voting for one or other of the ruling class won't do it. Peacefully telling them, we don't like what's going on. They don't give a fuck. They don't give a fuck. But if you cut into their profits, if you cut into their ability to keep order, if you take a direct shot at the infrastructure that is used to maintain and enforce police terror, on communities of color, other marginalized and racialized communities, suddenly your concerns matter. Suddenly there's room for negotiation about things. Outside tranquilizers have absolutely no idea how these things work. They have this idealized notion that you just let your rulers kind of know, and then you vote for some Democrats. That's always eventually in there. That you vote for some Democrats and it all gets sorted out. That's never how it works. It's never worked that way, and it hasn't changed since. If anything, the ruling class gives even less of a shit about us today than they did back 30 years ago. I mean, think about it. In Vietnam, only about 260-odd people have even caught COVID-19, almost all of them from other places. They caught it. They didn't catch it in Vietnam. There's no community spread. And you know what? In 3 months, they've been dealing with COVID-19 for about as long as we have here in the U.S. Nobody's died of it. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the minimum number of people who have been killed by this regime's bipartisan failure to do even the goddamn bare minimum to stop COVID-19, to contain the contagion, to save people's lives, is over 100,000. That's the minimum, because we don't have anywhere near as much testing going on, because testing might reveal just how fucking bad it is, and then people might do something about it. We're talking about the kind of people who are willing to just casually let a bare minimum of 100,000 people just die in 3 months, even though it's totally preventable. Even though there were things that could have been done that they would have cut into fucking profits. They would have increased worker bargaining power. They would have disincentivized work. Fuck you. You think these people care about us peacefully expressing our opinions? If they cared about that, this wouldn't be a problem now. If they cared about that, George Floyd would be alive right now. So would Mike Brown. So would Timothy Thomas. So would so many others. You want to say their names, but at the same time, there's so many whose names you don't even know. I mean, once every 28 hours, that you don't want to diminish the ones whose names you've never even heard. If peacefully expressing your opinion got us anywhere, every one of them would be alive right now, and practically half the fucking police force would be in jail, let's be honest. And the other half would be on probation. They don't give a fuck unless we fuck up their shit. That's the reality. Don't try to walk into these situations and try to calm shit down. Calming shit down helps our killers, helps the killers of George Floyd, helps the entire regime that's killing tens of thousands of people. Possibly at this point, according to some epidemiologists, maybe as much as hundreds of thousands of people, as much as 1 million people in this country, due to COVID-19 and the refusal to do anything about it. 70,000 people a year. Because the insurance company wants to make money, and the way they make money is refusing to provide people health care that's in their goddamn policies. Millions due to wars that have been going on for the past 20 years, despite peaceful protests that were supposed to stop them. Protests that some people still pretend are a success. When you try to calm shit down and keep it all peaceful and police the fucking thing, when you try to be an outside tranquilizer and smear every single person who does anything even slightly militant as an infiltrator, you are a collaborator. You might not realize it. You might have convinced yourself that what you're doing is what'll help things succeed. I don't see how you could possibly believe it with the history we're talking about. But you're working for the other side when you do it. Don't be an outside tranquilizer. This is another edition of the Untitled Anarchist Seagull channel. I'm your Untitled Anarchist Seagull. If you like this, please feel free to click like and subscribe. And I'm always happy to find new supporters over on my Patreon. The link for that's just about to show up. I thank all of my existing Patreon supporters. And Stay safe, mask up, and fight to win. All we've got is ourselves. Fortunately, we are all we've ever needed.